Inside Angola Prison, America's largest and most notorious maximum security jail. Louisiana State Penitentiary true crime documentary. The sun was burning hot over Louisiana, and the air smelled like dust and sweat. From a distance, Angola Prison looked calm, green fields, horses, and men working in the open land. But anyone who lived inside those tall fences knew the truth. Angola was a world of pain, fear, and survival. On that morning, a guard shouted, "Move faster!" as dozens of inmates bent over, cutting grass with dull blades. Some of them had been working there for 30 years. Their backs ached, their hands were rough, but they couldn't stop. If they did, the guards on horses would yell, or worse, pull out their guns. One man, a tall inmate named Herman Wallace, looked up at the guard tower. He whispered to the man beside him, "They don't see us as people. We're just part of the dirt here." Suddenly, a loud noise broke the silence, a fight near the edge of the field. Two inmates were wrestling, blood splashing on the dry soil. The guards rushed in. One shouted, "Get down!" The others raised their rifles. Within seconds, the field went quiet again. One man lay still on the ground. The rest stared in fear, knowing this was life in Angola, a place where one wrong move could end your life. This was not just a prison. It was a city of men trapped behind barbed wire and iron bars. Most of them would never leave. Over 6,000 inmates lived there, and nearly 80% were serving life sentences. But Angola had not always been this big. Its story began over 100 years ago on land that once held enslaved people. The name Angola came from the country in Africa where many of them had been taken. When slavery ended, that same land became a prison. The work never stopped, only the faces changed. Back in the early 1900s, prisoners lived in wooden shacks. They were beaten, starved, and worked to death. Guards didn't just watch, they ran the place like a slave camp. Inmates were forced to pick cotton, plow fields, and cut sugarcane under the burning sun. If they tried to rest, they were whipped. If they tried to escape, they were hunted down by bloodhounds. Even in the 1950s and 60s, things didn't get much better. People called it the farm, but it wasn't like the farms outside the prison. It was a living nightmare. One former guard once said, "You could smell fear here. It never leaves." By the 1970s, Angola was known as the bloodiest prison in America. Murders, beatings, and abuse happened every week. Inmates slept with shanks under their pillows because they never knew when someone might attack.
That's when three men, Herman Wallace, Albert Woodfox, and Robert King, decided to fight back. They were later called the Angola Three. They started speaking up about the violence, about the racial abuse, and about the unfair system that kept mostly black inmates locked up forever. They wanted peace, but the prison wanted silence. Then, one day, everything changed. A white prison guard was found dead. The officials blamed the Angola Three, even though there was no clear proof. The men shouted they were innocent, but no one listened. The warden ordered, "Lock them down." And from that day, Herman and Albert were placed in solitary confinement, tiny cells, no bigger than a bathroom. They stayed there for over 40 years. 40 years without hugging another person, 40 years without sunlight on their faces, 40 years with nothing but their thoughts and the sound of keys echoing down the hallway. Outside their cells, Angola kept running like a machine. Inmates still worked the fields, still sang songs under the sun, still dreamed of freedom they would never have. And then came something strange, something that shocked the world. The prison opened its gates to the public, not to show mercy, but to entertain. Every year, thousands of people from across America came to watch the Angola Prison Rodeo. Inmates became cowboys, riding wild bulls and racing horses, all for a few dollars and the short taste of excitement. The crowd laughed and cheered. For a few hours, it looked like fun. But behind the smiles, the truth was dark. Because every man in that arena was still a prisoner. Some of them would die there. As the crowd clapped and music played, Herman Wallace sat in his cell writing letters to the outside world. One of them read, "I am still here. They can take my freedom, but not my spirit." The question was, How long could his spirit really last in a place like Angola? The rain fell hard on the metal roof that morning. Inside the long hallway of Angola Prison, the sound echoed like thunder. Herman Wallace sat quietly in his small cell, counting every drop that hit the wall. 40 years in a box. That's how long the world outside had forgotten him.
His bed was a thin mat. His toilet was a metal bowl. His window was nothing but a slot the size of his hand. For 1 hour each day, he was allowed to walk in a tiny yard alone. No talking, no touch, no sunlight that lasted long enough to feel real. When the guards walked by, they never spoke. They just watched. The silence was heavier than the iron door. Herman wasn't the only one. Albert Woodfox was 2 cells down, locked in the same hell. The 2 men spoke by shouting through the cracks in the wall, using their voices like lifelines. "Still alive?" Herman would call. "Still fighting," Albert would answer. They had been accused of killing a prison guard named Brent Miller back in 1972, but there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, and no clear witness. Yet the state said they were guilty. Outside the prison, no one cared, not at first. But slowly, over the years, letters began to reach the outside world. Lawyers, journalists, and human rights activists started hearing about the Angola 3. People began asking, why are these men locked away for decades without proof? The prison officials didn't like that kind of attention. Angola has secrets, and not just about the 3. Behind those gates, violence ruled everything. Inmates formed gangs for protection. Others joined religious groups just to stay safe. The guards turned a blind eye, sometimes even using prisoners to control other prisoners. One man named Larry, who had spent 20 years there, once said, "If you don't follow the rules, you don't make it to morning." Every day was survival. There were fights in the showers, stabbings in the yard, and whispers about escape that never ended well. The lucky ones worked in the fields. The unlucky ones worked in the kitchen, where spoiled food was common and burns from boiling water were ignored. And yet, there was still a strange kind of order. Everyone knew the rules. Never turn your back on another inmate. Never speak against the guards. Never show fear. Because in Angola, fear was the real currency.
Outside, the rodeo continued. Every year, thousands of people came to see inmates face angry bulls. Some got trampled, others broke bones. The crowd cheered like it was a show, and in a way, it was. It made Angola look less like a place of suffering and more like a piece of Southern entertainment. But behind those smiling faces and cowboy hats, the truth was still rotting. Prisoners worked 12 hours a day in the hot fields for almost nothing. They picked crops that fed the guards and the prison system itself. They were still being treated like slaves, more than a century after slavery had ended. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1998, a lawyer named Nick Trentacosta received a letter from Albert Woodfox. In that letter, Albert wrote, "They buried us alive, but we are still breathing." Nick decided to visit Angola. What he found shocked him. The men had been in solitary confinement longer than anyone in American history. Their only contact with the outside world was paper and ink. When the story finally reached the news, people were horrified. Reporters called it a human rights nightmare. The United Nations later said it was cruel, inhumane, and degrading punishment. But even as the world began to learn the truth, Louisiana officials refused to admit any wrongdoing. They said, "Those men are dangerous. They deserve where they are." The years went on. Herman grew older. Albert's hair turned gray. They kept writing, kept fighting, kept hoping. Then one morning, a guard came to Herman's cell and said, "Pack your things." After 41 years, the court finally ruled that his conviction was unconstitutional. He was going home. When the door opened, Herman stepped into the sunlight. His hands shook, his eyes filled with tears. The air outside felt strange, like breathing for the first time. He said softly, "I'm free." But freedom came too late. Herman was dying from liver cancer. He spent only 3 days outside Angola before he passed away. The news spread fast. Angola prisoner freed after 41 years dies 3 days later. The world wept, and people began asking harder questions about the place called Angola. Albert was still inside. Robert King had already been released years earlier after proving his innocence. Now, only Albert remained. And deep inside his small cell, Albert whispered the same words every night: "I won't die in this cage." He had no idea that his fight was about to shake the entire prison system of America.
The morning light slipped through the smell slit in Albert Woodfox's cell door, drawing a thin line across the concrete floor. It was quiet, too quiet. After more than 40 years in solitary confinement, he could tell time by the sound of footsteps, the clanking of keys, and the distant echoes of the loudspeaker. But that morning felt different. Albert sat on the edge of his bunk, holding a letter in his hands. It was from a journalist who had written, "The world is watching you now." For the first time, Albert believed it. The story of the Angola 3 had reached every corner of the globe. People protested outside government buildings, shouting, "Free Albert Woodfox." Human rights groups, lawyers, and even politicians began to demand answers. How could a man be locked in a small cell for 43 years without proper evidence? How could a place like Angola still exist in modern America? Inside the prison, the pressure was rising. The warden walked the halls more often now, his face tight with anger. The guards were uneasy. Some inmates whispered they might finally let him go. Others said, "Don't believe it until you see the gate open." Albert kept his faith. He read books every day about justice, freedom, and forgiveness. He exercised in the tiny space between his bed and toilet, refusing to let his body or mind break. He once told a visitor, "They can control my body, but never my soul." But life inside Angola wasn't slowing down. The violence continued. Men were still working the fields, still fighting for survival. The smell of sweat, fear, and hopelessness hung heavy in the air. Every new inmate learned fast: don't trust anyone, don't cross the guards, keep your head down. Even with all the cameras and attention, Angola remained a place built on power and pain. It had changed faces over the years, but the heart of it stayed the same. A system designed to punish, not to heal. Then came February 19th, 2016. The metal door to Albert's cell opened. A guard stepped in and said, simply, "You're leaving." Albert froze. "What do you mean?" The guard looked at him and said, "You're going home." For a moment, Albert didn't move. His heart raced. After 43 years of waiting, fighting, and surviving, the words didn't seem real. He packed his few belongings, letters, books, and a small photo of his mother, and followed the guard down the long, cold hallway. Every step echoed like a drumbeat. The same halls where he had been chained, the same walls that had heard his cries, now led him to freedom. When he reached the gate, the sunlight hit his face, and tears filled his eyes. Albert Woodfox was finally free. He looked up at the sky and said softly, "This is for Herman, this is for Robert, this is for everyone still inside." News cameras surrounded him. Reporters asked, "What do you feel after all these years?" Albert smiled, his voice calm but strong. "I feel free, but Angola is still there. Thousands are still suffering. Don't forget them." That moment became history. The last member of the Angola 3 had walked out after 43 years of solitary confinement, the longest in U.S. history. The world watched in disbelief.
But even outside the prison walls, Albert never stopped fighting. He wrote a book called Solitary, telling his story to the world. He spoke to students, to leaders, and to anyone who would listen. His message was clear. What happened to me should never happen to anyone again. Meanwhile, Angola Prison remained open. It still held more than 6,000 men. Many of them still worked the same fields, still slept in overcrowded cells, still lived under the shadow of the guard towers. The rodeo still drew crowds, and the walls still hid stories the world would never see. But thanks to men like Albert, the truth could no longer be buried. The world now knew what was happening behind those bars. Years later, when Albert Woodfox passed away in 2022, people around the world remembered him not just as a prisoner, but as a survivor. His life had shown what courage looked like in the darkest place on earth. As the sun set over the fields of Angola, the sound of the guards' whistles echoed through the air. Somewhere, a new inmate looked up at the sky and whispered, "One day, I'll get out too." And beyond those gates, Albert's words lived on, floating like a promise in the Louisiana heat. They can lock the body, but they can never cage the soul. The air around Angola Prison was still heavy, just like it had been for more than a century. The wind carried the same sounds: barking dogs, the clank of metal gates, and the hum of insects from the fields that stretched for miles. But something had changed. The name Angola no longer stood for just a place. It had become a symbol, a mirror showing America what justice could look like when it lost its heart. After Albert Woodfox's release, people across the world wanted to see what was really happening inside Angola. Reporters came with cameras, and human rights groups demanded answers. Some lawmakers promised investigations. Yet, behind the tall fences and razor wire, life continued as usual. The fields were still full of men in pale uniforms, bent under the burning Louisiana sun. Guards on horseback still shouted commands, their rifles glinting in the light. The routine never stopped. Wake up, line up, work, eat, and sleep. For the men inside, days blurred into each other. In one corner of the prison, an older inmate named James sat under a small tree. He had been there for 30 years. "People think Angola changed," he said quietly. "But when that gate closes, the world forgets you." James remembered the day Albert was released. He'd watched it on the tiny prison TV. "He made it," he whispered then, feeling hope for the first time in years. But hope was hard to keep alive in a place like this. Still, Albert's story had planted a seed. More inmates began writing letters to lawyers and journalists. Some even studied law from behind bars, helping others fight unfair sentences. Angola was still a prison, but now there were voices echoing through those walls, refusing to stay silent. Outside, the public started seeing Angola differently. Documentaries showed the harsh labor, the overcrowded cells, and the history of racism that ran through the prison's veins. People learned that Angola was once a plantation, and that even now, many of its inmates, mostly black men, worked the same land their ancestors had been forced to. The truth hit hard, but for some, it was too easy to ignore.
The prison rodeos still ran every year. Tourists still came to watch inmates wrestle bulls and ride horses. They laughed, clapped, and bought souvenirs. To them, it was a show. But for the men behind the fences, it was survival. The rodeo gave them a brief taste of freedom, a few dollars, and cheers they hadn't heard in years. Yet, when the show ended, they went right back to their cells. One journalist asked a warden, "Do you think Angola can ever change?" The warden replied, "This is a prison, not a playground. People come here to be punished, not reformed." But change, slow and small, began to creep in. The story of the Angola 3 made it impossible to hide what was happening. Some inmates were moved out of solitary confinement. Others were given better access to medical care and education. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Then came 2022. The news spread that Albert Woodfox had died. Around the world, tributes poured in. People called him a symbol of endurance and a man who proved that hope can live anywhere. Inside Angola, the men stood silently when they heard him. Some bowed their heads, others just stared at the ground. Even those who had never met him felt like they had lost one of their own.
That night, the prison yard was quiet. The floodlights cast long shadows across the barbed wire. Somewhere deep inside, an inmate whispered, "He got out. Maybe one day I will too." Time went on, but Albert's name stayed alive. In letters, in books, in every story told about Angola. He had shown that one voice, even behind thick walls, could reach the world. Today, Angola still stands. 18,000 acres of land surrounded by fences, holding thousands of men who may never see freedom again. But outside those walls, people are watching. Lawyers are fighting, and the truth is no longer buried. As the sun sets over the wide Louisiana fields, the guards ride back toward the towers. The prisoners walk slowly to their dorms. The sound of clanking metal doors fills the air one last time. And somewhere beyond the fences, the memory of Albert Woodfox whispers through the wind. Angola is still there, but so are the people who will keep fighting for those inside, because even behind bars, the human spirit refuses to die. As the sun sets over the fields of Angola, the echoes of history still linger in the air, whispers of pain, resistance, and survival. Once built on the grounds of a slave plantation, this prison remains a reflection of America's most haunting truths. For more than a century, Angola has been a place where justice, punishment, and redemption collide, where thousands of men live their entire lives behind barbed wire, surrounded by silence and memories of freedom. But amid the fences and fields, stories like that of the Angola 3 remind us that even in the darkest places, the human spirit can still fight for light, for justice, for dignity, and for a voice. Today, Angola stands not just as a prison, but as a mirror, forcing America to look back and question how far it has truly come. This is not just a story of one prison, it's the story of a nation still grappling with its past. You've been watching a true crime documentary based on real events. Subscribe for more real stories from America's most shocking crimes, investigations, and courtroom battles.